The film Little Big Man was directed by Arthur Penn and released in 1970. It was based on a novel written by Thomas Berger in 1964 in which a 121-year-old man retells his life story of being raised by the Cheyenne Indians and attempting to blend that experience with civilization within the western United States. Little Big Man may be considered one of the greatest western movies of all time, but it was by no means your stereotypical approach to this genre. Let's start off by defining what a genre is. A genre is understood as the categorization of narrative films by the story they tell and how they tell them. The Western is one of the most recognizable genres, along with horror, science fiction, musical, and gangster films. These genres are identifiable by their conventions, which include recurring themes and situations, setting, character types, and story formulas. Context also helps to define a film's conventions through the use of decor, lighting, sound, and even movie stars that are often associated with that particular genre. Although Little Big Man isn't your typical Western, heavy laden with scenarios such as cowboys versus Indians, local saloon bar fights, life on the prairie, and romance between the hero and the damsel in distress, there are conventions that this film does employ that fall in line with this category. For instance, as mentioned in our text, Westerns are dominated by daylight exterior shots and scenes. Little Big Man was filmed largely during the day in Montana, particularly on historic sites such as Little Bighorn and the Crow Indian reservations. This provided a more realistic delivery of the story through natural light and historically accurate recreations of settings. Character types that are present within the film are the Native American, gunslingers, settlers, a band of outlaws, the cavalry, and even a prostitute. And the film clearly demonstrates a recurring theme of civilization conflicting with wilderness by the relentless and brutal resistance of the United States Armed Forces against the Native Americans. Common themes we'll see in this Western film are wide open spaces, settlers' towns, local saloons, cavalry, Native Americans, gunslingers, outlaws, and prostitutes. The protagonist in Western films is often a cowboy, gunslinger, or lawman who heroically saves the day in some fashion. However, in Little Big Man, Dustin Hoffman's character Jack Crabb is more a survivor of his circumstances and less so a typical heroic figure of little talk and more action. In fact, the entirety of the film demonstrates a man who lacks a clear identity as he explores many opportunities to find his place and happiness in life. From Cheyenne tribal member to reformed religious do-gooder, capitalistic venturer to gunslinger, storekeeper and husband to a drunkard on the street, cavalry scout to madman. The Cheyennes refer to themselves as human beings, while the white man is represented as more savage in nature. This is best illustrated when comparing two separate instances when Jack Crabb was held at the mercy of others. First, the young Jack Crabb's family is killed by the Pawnee Indians, and he and his sister were rescued by the Cheyenne Indians. They expected to be treated with hostility, only to receive respect and hospitality. Later, when Crabb was working as a snake oil salesman and a group of outlaws came upon them, they were tied up and made a mockery of despite being of the same race. General George Armstrong Custer is a historically famous military leader who was celebrated for his bravery and nobility. He led the 7th Cavalry Regiment at the Battle of Little Bighorn, where he died in what is known as Custer's Last Stand. Despite the high regard with which historical sources present Custer's life and military achievements, Little Big Man clearly portrays him as a pompous tyrant hell-bent on destroying the Native Americans and seizing their land. In consideration of Little Big Man being labeled as a revisionist Western film, these unconventional character types are not only fulfilling an enlightened expectation, but also provide a means for understanding the director's intent behind the story. According to our text of Looking at Movies, a narrative is a type of movie and is defined as a way of structuring fictional or fictionalized stories presented in narrative films. Anytime a filmmaker consciously chooses and organizes material so that one event leads to another in a recognizable progression, the filmmaker is employing narrative in its most basic sense. We see this cause and effect nature of Little Big Man, where one thing leads to another, to another, to another. Young Jack Crabb is adopted by the Cheyennes after the murder of his family, but his need for survival leads him to a civilized life among the settlers. He then decides to embrace the Christian way of life. However, hypocrisy in religion causes him to embrace a new identity as a snake oil salesman. This nefarious career leads him to reconciliation with his sister, who persuades him to yet another shift in identity when he takes up gunslinging. Witnessing the death of a man causes him to turn a new leaf and become a storekeeper and husband. He ends up losing everything, including his wife, and then returns to the Cheyenne, which leads him to find a new wife, Sunshine. Unfortunately, the cavalry led by General Custer ends up massacring his whole family, and afterward he flees back to civilization only to become a town drunk. Eventually, he crosses paths with General Custer again and devises a plan to act as a scout for his regiment in hopes of finding an opportunity for revenge. These events are products of decisions that Dustin Hoffman's character makes, even with its own set of consequences, and tie together a stream of progressive probabilities that one may or may not expect. Director Arthur Penn made several movies before Little Big Man, including other Western films such as Bonnie and Clyde and The Left-Handed Gun. Little Big Man was considered a revisionist Western, in which common myths regarding historical figures and events, or the quote-unquote true nature of a particular civilization, were presented in contrast. Penn had taken on this task previously when he shattered the idealism of Billy the Kid in his film The Left-Handed Gun, in which Billy was portrayed as a tormented anti-hero in dire need of revenge. Little Big Man follows suit with its juxtaposition of Western civilization versus wilderness, the white man versus Native Americans, and ultimately corruption versus dishonor. Arthur Penn wanted to make a movie that opposed Hollywood's glamorization of the American West history while using it as a platform to protest the war in Vietnam. Horrific actions in the name of this war, such as the My Lai massacre, were symbolically recreated in scenes that depicted the murder of innocent civilians, unarmed mothers, and children. Given Penn's history of serving in the U.S. military, the circumstances of the Vietnam War, and a genre of film that was built on the foundation of establishing Western civilization in Native American land, he felt passionate about pursuing an unorthodox approach to commonly accepted character representations for a Western film. Arthur Penn stated, "One can tell a tale of certain kind of historical verisimilitude with the exterior details in place and the internal truth absolutely absent. I think that has been largely true of the American history, particularly as it relates to the American Indians."